It's hard to believe that in our very recent history, homosexuality was still illegal in Ireland, right up till 1993. This meant that back in the 80s, you were a criminal because of your sexual orientation. For obvious reasons, the majority hid their sexuality, and those who were open about it left themselves open to all kinds of discrimination and abuse. In 1982, there were 2 separate cases where gay men were murdered in Dublin, and the outcry that followed certainly changed history. Back then, sex was something that was not spoken of, and homosexuality was a word never heard by many of the teenagers of the time, especially in rural areas. It was very difficult, if you can imagine, having these feelings that you can't put a name on and not knowing if there were others like you. The first murder took place in Monkstown in the suburbs of Dublin. The victim worked at RTE, the only TV station in Ireland at that time. He was a set designer on the most well-known programme, The Late Late Show, and he lived with another well-known DJ. Charles Self was from England, but he was residing in Ireland and openly gay. On the day of his death, he had been out in Dublin City having a boozy lunch with his friend and then later having drinks in a pub. He went for a takeaway after closing time, and he was seen around public toilets that were known to be a discreet spot for hookups with gay men. He took a taxi back to the house with an unknown fair-haired man, and the taxi driver recalled them being amorous, which at the time would probably have made him feel uncomfortable. An older man also stayed at the house and was in bed. He heard the couple arrive and heard some friendly chattering. The DJ was not there that night. At some point, the older man recalled a man with dark curly hair coming into his bedroom, but then realising it was the wrong room and leaving. The next morning, that man, who was called Bertie, got up to find Charles had been badly beaten and stabbed. He was dead by the front door. It bears belief that the man who had heard chattering could not have heard such a violent struggle. What should have been a really high-profile case was pretty much swept under the carpet, as it was believed that Charles had perhaps brought home a rent boy, although he had not been robbed. The severity of the attack indicated it was more of a personal attack, like a crime of passion or hate. As so many were in the closet, they did not appreciate Gardaí coming to question them, and it struck fear in the community. The Gardaí are said to have not been very empathic or discreet. The murder was never solved, and there is much confusion over the conflict of descriptions of who was saw in the taxi compared to the man that Bertie saw. A man by the name of MacArthur was convicted on other brutal killings, and many believe there was a striking resemblance between him and the sketch that was made of the dark curly-haired man that had been seen in Charles's house. MacArthur had been known to frequent the same pubs as Charles Self. An interesting twist to this story is that 14 years later, the man who hired Charles Self disappeared, and neither he or his car were ever recovered. So many loose ends. Another murder that same year was not kept under wraps in the same way. It came to be known as the Fairview Park murder. A young gay man was making his way home and was set upon by a group of youths who beat him to death. They were arrested and charged, but at trial, although convicted, all received suspended sentences, meaning that none of them actually served jail time. This time it was not only the gay community who were up in arms, it had highlighted the level of discrimination against homosexuals in the country. Although Irish people were notorious for sweeping things under the carpet, this incident brought it all out in the open. It may have been still difficult for society to understand or accept homosexuality, but they certainly saw injustice and supported movement for change. Tragic as it was an event that changed Ireland gradually, and looking at it now, it's hard to believe the way things were not that many years ago. Just as Stonewall is commemorated every year at Pride, the Fairview Park murder is thought to be Ireland's Stonewall movement and will never be forgotten.